Here is 5.3 factoring day 3. Reminder, we will be having a quiz after this section, just focusing on factoring with the different methods. This slide, you don't need to write down, is just to review what are the factoring processes. Number 1, you always want to check to see if there is a GCF. Factor that out first, the common monomial, before you do any other method. Step 2 is to check to see if there are any leftover methods of factoring. So first ways to check is if you have two terms, which is a binomial, look and see if you can factor by using the difference of two squares. If you have a trinomial, which is 3 terms, there are 2 different ways to factor. If your leading coefficient is 1, you use the T-chart method. If your leading coefficient is not 1, then we use the AC method. The last type is your terms that are what we call quadnomial, where you have 4 terms. Then we factor by grouping. We're going to go ahead now and move on to our slides. We're going to practice this factoring. First example, I do want you to write these examples down. So we're going to look to see first if there is a GCF. So go ahead and write the example down, x cubed minus x. What is the GCF? What is in common with both terms? Well, an x is in common with both terms. So I can take out the x out of those 2 terms. I'm left with x squared minus 1. Now I look inside of the parentheses and I see how many terms there are. There are 2 terms. It's a binomial. So I remember that a binomial I can factor using the difference of 2 squares. So I still have the x, and now I can break off this parenthesis into x and x, 1 and 1, and then what remember goes in the middle there? The minus and plus, or plus and minus. Second example. Here is a trinomial. Again, the first thing we want to do is look and see if there is a GCF to pull out, a common monomial with all 3 terms. What can we divide out of that equation? Well, we can divide out a 2. So what I'm left with when I divide out 2 out of 2x squared is x squared. When I divide out by 6x, I'm left with 3x. And the last term, negative 20 divided by 2 is negative 10. Now I look inside of the parentheses. In the parentheses, I have a trinomial, and its leading coefficient is 1. So I can use the T-chart method. So I set up my T-chart, and I say, what are the factors of C? So I'm going to factor my negative 10. I'm going to say, what is it going to add to the middle term? So it's going to sum to B, which is 3, and that's this term here. So then I will list out the different possibilities. Remember, once I get to that possibility, I can stop my T-chart. So I would say, okay, 5 times negative 2. Well, 5 times negative 2 is negative 10. When I add those 2 terms together, 5 plus negative 2, I get 3. That's the one I'm looking for. I'm looking for 3. So the numbers I work with are 5 and negative 2. So let's go ahead and factor this trinomial. Remember, I already took out the 2 in front of the parentheses. Now I want to factor in that parentheses. So I can factor it into 2 parentheses. I'm going to erase the big parentheses now and factor it into 2 parentheses. So when I factor the trinomial, remember I split up the x's, so x and x, and then a positive 5 and a negative 2 comes from my T-chart. Positive 5, negative 2. If I wanted to check these answers, remember I could FOIL them back out, multiply them back out to standard form to see that I get the original trinomial back. All right, let's move on to the next example. 2y squared minus 18. Again, we look to see if there's a GCF. Is there a GCF in this problem? Can I divide evenly by some monomial? I can. I can take out a 2. So what I'm left with is y squared minus 9. Now I look inside of that parentheses. It's a binomial. So I remember binomials, I can factor using the difference of two squares. Don't forget that 2 still has to stay in front. So now the difference of two squares, I split up the y and the y. And then the perfect square for 9 is 3 times 3. So I split up the 3 and the 3. And then what goes in between is the minus and plus, or plus and minus. Next example, I'm going to have you try and find out what is the GCF of that example. The GCF you should have found is 3. So I'm going to divide all 3 terms by 3. If you still like to do this off to the side, so you're showing your work, you can do that, or you can do it in your head. So 3 divided by 3 is 1. So you just have the x squared left. And then 3 divided by 3 is 1. So you're left with negative 1x. And then 36 divided by 3 is 12. And then you have the negative out in front. Now I'm going to continue factoring within the parentheses. It's a trinomial. Its leading coefficient is 1. So I can use the T-chart method again. If it was not 1, then I'd have to use the AC method. So now I'm going to factor the C, which is negative 12. And then I'm going to add it to the middle term, B, which is negative 1. So now I set up my chart. I'm going to have you go ahead and see if you can find the factors of negative 12 that add to negative 1. All right, what you should have found is negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. When you add those two numbers together, you get negative 1. So the numbers we're going to work with is negative 4 and 3. All right, so now we're set to factor that parentheses. So we still have the 3 in front. We can't forget that. So now we split up the x squared into x and x. And then our two terms we're working with are negative 4 and positive 3. So what goes in there is negative 4, positive 3. We're going to stop this movie. It's about 8.5 minutes long. And then we have one shorter video left.